Good evening, or afternoon, or morning, whenever you are watching these. This week we are going to talk about another of the groups that are trying to influence you as we come up to this election, and that is, of course, political parties. We're going to look a little bit about the history of how we got to the parties we have now, why we have a two-party system, some trends. So let's get started. What is a political party and how is it different from any other kind of faction? So I guess that's one place to start. If you'll remember when you read Federalist 10, Madison talks about the problem of factions. And political parties are definitely a group that could be considered a faction. They're a group of people that organize to try to get their members into government office in order to run the government, in order to decide what policies are passed. And if they are using that power of the government for things other than the common good, then they would fall into Madison's definition of a faction. Other groups that we're going to look at as well, things like lobbyists or special interest groups, are similar to political parties. They are similar in that they are groups of people that have organized to try to influence what the government does. But the difference is that political parties do so by means of trying to get their members elected. So it's more direct. They are not part of the government. None of the groups we are looking at in this unit are actually part of the government, although I suppose part of the political party is in government, but the party itself is not a part of government. And actually the original idea, the framers were hoping to avoid political parties. There were political parties back in England and other countries, so the idea was not new, but they were hoping not to have them because they can be very problematic. So a political party is an organization of people that comes together, works together to try to get its members into positions of power in the government to help shape public policy. Often they will be coalitions of groups with aligned interests, but not identical interests. So parties identify candidates, they nominate them to run for office, they help run the elections, run the campaigns, they'll even run the polling places. And then if they are successful, then the members of the party that are elected to government will actually govern. So political parties give you also another avenue for getting involved. So yes, how do they differ from other kinds of political organizations? They run candidates, not just endorsing candidates. Often special interest groups will endorse a candidate, but parties actually run their own candidates. They are seeking to govern. They tend not to be terribly narrowly focused. They tend to have a broad range of issues around an ideological idea. So there'll be hopefully some consistency of point of view, but they apply that to a broad range of issues in order to bring together enough people to get their candidates elected. They're quasi-public organizations, but again, not part of government. The party platform, if you've heard that phrase, that is a formal statement of what the party's principles are and what policies they are seeking to get enacted, what their policy objectives are. So one of the things the parties do every 4 years in advance of a presidential election is they'll have a big national convention where they will officially announce who their presidential candidate is going to be. Usually that's already known well in advance. But they will also, the delegates at the convention will come together and negotiate what are going to be what are called the planks of the platform. What are those policy objectives and principles going to be? What is it that is going to define the party? What is it we're all rallying around? Or they are hoping we will all rally around. I'm going to do a brief run through of the political parties and how they have changed throughout U.S. history. Political scientists have organized this into what they call a series of party systems. That is, they looking back at U.S. history, they've noticed inflection points where there have been major realignments. Either there have been changes of one party ceased to be strong enough to run candidates nationwide, or another party emerged, or the membership of a party changed even if the name didn't, or the direction of a party significantly changed. So those major shifts, and they have organized these into what they call a various party systems, and we are going to look at that. All right, the first party system started with the adoption of the Constitution in 1789 and extended till 1828. Although 1789, really it didn't start for another 8 years, because the first two elections, really the political parties, their political parties didn't play a big role, because George Washington was the hero of the war, and he was overwhelmingly chosen. So there was really no competition as long as Washington was on the ticket. But you did, even that early, start to have this sort of break into what would become the political parties. Alexander Hamilton on one side, and Jefferson and his backers, including James Madison. So if you remember the Federalist Papers, Hamilton and Madison were the two main authors on that. They cooperated to get the Constitution passed, but they had very different ideas about how strong and how much centralized authority there should be in the national government. Hamilton wanted a much stronger national government, and Jefferson and Madison and other opponents of that, in fact, accused him of being really a royalist, that he wanted to make George Washington king and establish basically a monarchy here in the United States. Hamilton and others who had been Federalist favored more strength in the national government. Jefferson and Madison sided with Jefferson and his backers, who were still leery. Madison had favored the Constitution. He thought that we needed something stronger than the Articles of Confederation, but still was leery of that centralized power and wanted to keep more power for the states. So Jefferson, Madison, and their backers were in opposition, and eventually they come to be known as the Democratic Republicans, or sometimes referred to as the Jeffersonian Republicans, to distinguish them from modern-day Republicans. So you have the Federalists on one side and the Jeffersonian Republicans, or the Democratic Republicans, on the other. Washington was a Federalist. And so Washington was a Federalist. The Federalists won those first two elections overwhelmingly because George Washington. And then they won the third election. John Adams had been Washington's vice president, and Adams was a Federalist. Adams was elected. But in 1800, the fourth election, Jefferson had been Adams' vice president, because the original way the Electoral College worked is that the electors would only vote for president. Whoever got the most votes would become president, and whoever got the second most votes would become vice president. So, yeah, that didn't really work, because Jefferson was kind of a jerk. He wasn't interested in coming together and cooperating. That had been the idea behind the system, was that, yes, but once you get a party division, then your opponent is going to be your vice president, which, if you're able to work together, is wonderful, because then you've got bipartisan support in the executive branch, and which hopefully then builds bipartisan support everywhere. But Jefferson was not that kind of a guy. Great with the inspiring words, otherwise kind of a jerk. And so instead, he just makes life very difficult for John Adams. And it became really clear that that system of having the first and second try to work together wasn't always going to work. It was often going to be very problematic. So when you get to the fourth election, in the election of 1800, Jefferson, both candidates, both Jefferson and Adams, run with a running mate. So they run and trying to convince the electors to vote for two people instead of just one, with the idea that then you wouldn't have that divide between the president and the vice president. The Federalist figured out that, well, if all of our electors vote for both Adams and his running mate, well, then there's going to be a tie. So some of them didn't vote for his running mate so that they would come in 1-2. The problem is, well, first of all, the Jeffersonian Republicans won more votes, and their electors hadn't figured that out. So Jefferson's running mate was Aaron Burr, and they tied, even though it had been very clear during the campaign that it was Jefferson running for president, and the idea was that Burr would be his vice president. Since they tied, the Constitution said that that goes to the House of Representatives to decide, and the House did make Jefferson president, but it marks a couple of things. It marks the beginning of the end for the Federalist Party, because they hung on for a while, but they really didn't come back from that election, and they finally folded after they opposed the War of 1812, even though it was really very popular at the time. So that lost them a whole lot of support in the country, and finally the Federalist Party ended. But it also marked that realization that something had to change. That the fact that political parties had developed, they weren't going away, they were here to stay. Something needed to change about the way elections were done. And so the 12th Amendment was adopted, and that changed the Electoral College a little bit. It changed it to where the electors would cast two ballots, one for president and one for vice president. So those two elections would happen separately, so you couldn't have that way to get a tie. And it also said that if nobody got a majority of the votes, it changed how many candidates the House of Representatives would have to choose from. So what it said was, if nobody wins a majority in the Electoral College for the office of president, then the top three vote getters, the House would decide between the top three vote getters. And if no one got a majority for vice president, then the Senate would decide there. So that also meant that if the House got stymied, you knew you were going to have a vice president, which could become president if the House can't decide who the president should be. So also incentivizes the House to make up their mind. So that's going to come into play a little bit later on. But that changed. That amendment reflected this stress put on the system by the emergence of those two major parties. That from that point, from 1815 to about 1828, you have what's called the era of good feelings. It was basically a one-party system where the Democratic Republicans were the party. You had President James Madison, James Monroe, John Quincy Adams, and I put an asterisk there by John Quincy Adams because his election marks a significant shift and the end of this first party system. Adams was elected in 1824, and that year there were several candidates, all members of the Democratic Republican Party, because it was basically a one-party system at that point. So they were splitting the vote between them, and the person who got the most votes in the Electoral College was Andrew Jackson. John Quincy Adams got the second most votes. But Jackson had not gotten a majority, so it goes to the House of Representatives. Now, because of the 12th Amendment, the House of Representatives was limited to considering the top 3 vote getters. But here's the thing. The 4th runner-up really did not like Andrew Jackson. So he threw his support behind John Quincy Adams, which shifted the scale in Adams' favor. Adams becomes the president. Andrew Jackson feels cheated. And that causes him to split his own party in 1828, marking the end of this first party system. So the first party system was Federalists against the Jeffersonian Republicans, later the Democratic Republicans, and it ends because the Federalist Party fades off and then the Democratic Republican Party splits. And they split into 2 parties. The Democratic Party, which was headed by Andrew Jackson, who was elected overwhelmingly in 1828. He was a populist, and he was the first person he really played a different kind of campaign. He really played up the fact that states were beginning to expand the franchise to get rid of the laws saying that you had to own a certain amount of property in order to be able to vote. So he's appealing more to the masses, to the common man, and offering things that the common man wanted, like promising them that he'd open up land to the west for more settlement. Now, what that meant was he's also responsible for the Trail of Tears, because the way he was going to open up a lot of that land was he was going to drive the Native Americans off of it. So there's that. Populist leaders are often riding a wave of sentiment that maybe we later learn to regret. But he was also into what's called the spoils system. So he's also one that starts building one of the first political machines, starts working with local politicos and promising them jobs in his administration if he wins. So starting to build those grassroots networks that the parties today are built upon. So not just appealing to a sort of elite, but really going for the common man. The economic elites, alarmed by this, went and they founded what's called the Whig Party. So the Democratic Republicans essentially split. You get the Jacksonian Democrats and the Whigs. And the Whigs were fiscal conservatives. They represented in the South. They were the Southern plantation owners, the landowners, and in the North they were industrial capitalists, people with a little more money, upper middle class and above, people who were fearful of some of that populist sentiment and were more interested in government policies that helped them become wealthier. So this is the second party system, and it's seeing the politicization of the previously excluded mass of citizens. The third party system comes into effect prior to the Civil War, and really because of the tensions over abolition that started putting stress on both of the existing parties. So the Democrats that you have, if you're appealing to the working man, it's not clear that the working man wants slavery to end, because freeing the enslaved population looks like more people competing for the jobs that the working man has. And so it was, plus the Whigs, then of course part of their party is the Southern plantation owners. So you get a new anti-slavery party, the Republicans, formed in 1854 and gained the support of the abolitionists, those members of the Whig Party who were abolitionists, and Democrats in the North, but not in the South. So it takes pieces from both of the existing parties, leaving the remnant of the Whig Party basically disappears. The Democratic Party is left with those who are supporting slavery and with their base really being strongly in the South. So 1860, Lincoln's victory in that election began a period of dominance for the anti-slavery Republicans. So obviously, if you know American history, you also know that the election of Lincoln leads to the Civil War because of the abolitionist bent of the Republican Party and the South not wanting any part of that. But the Civil War ended with the South conquered, and the party of Lincoln ends slavery in the South, extends the franchise, gives African American men the right to vote, and enjoys the support of those African American men in the South. You also had, as a result of Reconstruction, a lot of white men in the South who had been part of the Confederacy lost the right to vote. So that also shifts. And for decades, the Republicans were winning elections at all levels in the South, including some African Americans getting into government. So not just voting, but electing Black people to state and local and even federal government in those years right after the Civil War. This is the era when the political machines really come to dominate in the big city political landscape. Each of those, so this is a little local organization headed by a boss. It's a patronage system. So you support your party, and if your party wins, then you are rewarded with jobs or government contracts. If you are running a business, then you support them, and when they're in power, they support you. Now, obviously, this is a bit of a perversion of the system, right? It's corrupt, but it's useful in getting elected, because this is exactly the problem of faction. They're not looking to the public good. They're not looking to, are these contractors the best person for the job? Are we going to get the best quality or the lowest price or the best combination of those two things? No, they're going, are they on our team or the other team? And that's how you're deciding who to give contracts to, who to give jobs to. It's not the most qualified person. It's who just rewarding your friends. So it's corrupt, but it's useful in getting elected. Right. The fourth party system started with the election, or was marked to the election of 1896, which was a big realignment in the issues that people were concerned with. The Republicans still continued to dominate, but the political landscape really changed, because we're no longer looking at abolition. Post-Civil War, we're no longer looking at Reconstruction. Instead, we are dealing with the fact that you've had a lot of people moving into urban areas, and the issues that come up with that. You're having issues of labor versus capital and business trusts forming, and you also had a fairly significant depression that changed the things that people were concerned about. So you have a realignment of what the issues are. And in 1896, the Republicans put together a coalition that they narrowly won in 1896, but that would give them a solid base going forward. That 1896 election also had a ton of other parties involved. So this issue, this issues in what we would now call the progressive era. So you get the election of William McKinley in 1901. William McKinley is assassinated right here in Buffalo, and Theodore Roosevelt becomes the youngest person to become president, inaugurated right here in Buffalo, and won re-election twice. He then and was very progressive. He was very much into the trust busting. He was also a conservationist. And he grooms his successor and then decides that he is unhappy with the way that it's being done. So he then runs against him. So in 1812, Theodore Roosevelt does not win the nomination of the Republican Party, even though he'd been a two-term Republican president. So he runs as a progressive under what he called the Bull Moose Party, because he manages to split the vote. He does take a lot of votes away from Taft, who had been his replacement, but he manages to split the vote, giving Woodrow Wilson the presidency. However, this is the one that the fact that he split the vote is the one time during this period where you have a Democrat winning the presidency. And even though Wilson was a Democrat, a lot of the Progressive Party's reform ideas were still enacted because they were really dominating the political landscape. The Republicans are going to retain control of the presidency through the 1920s, and the next major realignment you're going to get is in 1932 with the Great Depression. And that shift brings us to the fifth party system and the Democratic Party taking dominance from 1932 to 1968. In 32, you get the rise of another Roosevelt. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, known as FDR. Yes, they were related, but not really closely. And opposite political parties. Roosevelt was elected during the Great Depression, and if you're wondering, hey, if Teddy Roosevelt was president twice and then running for re-election again, wait a minute, can't you only run twice? Well, Franklin Roosevelt was elected 4 times. Up until this point, there was no legal limit on how many terms a president could serve. It was tradition from the time of George Washington, because Washington had served 2 terms and then retired. It was tradition for presidents not to serve more than 2 terms. But there was no law against it until FDR. FDR serves 4 consecutive terms, and the opposition then succeeds in getting an amendment to the Constitution limiting the president to 2 terms or 10 years. Roosevelt's, one of the things he's really known for is his New Deal, because he comes in at the midst of the Great Depression, and the Great Depression was an economic situation that it was intractable. The things that normally worked were not working, and so Roosevelt comes in with his New Deal, this idea that the government should provide a safety net for people, that we should use the power of taxation to redistribute wealth to protect the most disadvantaged members of society. And we already talked a little bit about the resistance he found in the Supreme Court. Eventually, that resistance is overcome by his court packing scheme. He was supported by a coalition of Southern Democrats, Northern city dwellers, Catholics, the working class, African Americans, and women. So he's putting together the coalition that starts to look a lot like the coalition of the modern Democratic Party. And this is a big shift. It's the first time anybody's courted women Of course, women didn't get the vote until relatively late. But it's a big shift for African Americans who had, up until this point, voted for the party of Lincoln. So they were strongly Republican voting bloc until the Great Depression. But with the changes in the economic landscape, they were amongst those who were most hurt by the Depression. So those who had the least were the ones that were the hardest hit by the Depression. And the Democratic Party under Roosevelt is building a coalition and crafting policy to appeal to those folks. So this fifth party system really opens up the idea that courting a lot more people to get engaged in politics and making constituencies that had not been important up until that time important, women and African Americans. And the Democratic Party dominated. Eisenhower was the only Republican president of that era. And again, Eisenhower was a victorious general from World War II. So victorious generals have you win a big war, you get a big surge of public approval. Democrats won the White House in 1960 and 1964, but coming into the 60s, you have another big realignment. And again, this has to do with the civil rights movement and the Vietnam War as well. So coming into the 60s, you have those two big pivotal events that are going to shift alignments, divide members of the party. That coalition they had put together divides over these two issues, and you get another realignment. And that brings us to the sixth party system, which starts in 1968. And I really should have put a question. I put to the present, but maybe I should have put a question mark there. Because you only really recognize when these periods have changed once you're clearly in the next period and can look back at it and go, okay, that's the moment it changed. And this one may have pivoted, but it's not clear. From the civil rights era to the present, it has not been characterized by one party really dominating the presidency. It has shifted back and forth. You had some big realignments, though. You have the southern states and northern working class switching from Democratic to Republican. So not all the working class in the North, but a significant number of them. And those Jim Crow, those white, they had been known as the Dixiecrats, that were really starting to be out of step with the Democratic Party. Once you get into the civil rights movement, they kind of split because these Democrats in the South, the Dixiecrats, were pro-Jim Crow, pro-segregation, segregation now, segregation forever. They were really, and yet you have Democratic presidents like John F. Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson leading the charge for civil rights. So you have it's whether you think the party left them or they left the party, they part ways with the Democratic Party and see more of their interests aligned, their more conservative values aligned with the Republican Party. Now, I am not saying that the Republican Party therefore went from the party of Lincoln, that the party of abolition, to the party of Jim Crow. No, the country moved past that idea that segregation was okay. And but the former Dixiecrats then found that they have more in common because they are more socially conservative and wanting smaller government. That is one thing that's always been characteristic of the South, right? The whole Civil War, part of the Civil War was about, we don't want the federal government telling us what to do, the nullification. And so that there was a realignment there. It also included some northern working class people looking at it and thinking, less government interference in my life, and being more socially conservative. Conservative Christians, especially evangelical Christians in the South, also start to align very strongly with Republican politics. And that sets up a tension that is there today, where you have some social wanting less government in the economy, but more government in social issues, more government dictating conservative morals. At the same time, you've also had a lot of immigration. You've had the Latinx populations and Asian immigrant populations tend to be more democratic. This sixth party system is characterized by divided government. So while we haven't had one party really dominating the presidency, what we have had very strongly is a pattern of having the president belong to one party and the voters giving at least one or often both chambers of Congress to the other party. So splitting it, which causes some problems, and increasing political polarization. So these graphs indicate a little bit, you can kind of see graphically for those who are more visually oriented, you can see the polarization happening, how in the early 70s, you have a whole lot more to the middle, so that both parties were seeking it, playing this balancing game of trying to show how we're different and yet appeal to the middle. And over time, that middle disappearing and the parties moving farther and farther apart. So I touched on this just a moment ago, but divided government is what we call it when one party controls the presidency and the other party controls at least one chamber of Congress. Since 1969, this has happened slightly more than 2/3 of the time. So that has been one of the big characteristics of this sixth party system. What does divided government makes fulfilling campaign promises really difficult. Candidates can promise you the moon, but then if they don't have control of Congress, it's very hard to get your agenda passed because it only takes one house to really slow it down. And in the Senate, it doesn't necessarily even take the opposition controlling the Senate, because the Senate operates on Senate's very traditional, and they have sort of gentlemen's agreements about they want to reach consensus rather than merely split on party line votes and be simple majority rule. So any member who feels really strongly about something can do what's called a filibuster, can just keep talking until everybody else gives up, try to wear the other side down and just keep talking and prevent a vote from happening. And in order to bring that to an end, it takes 60 votes. So you need 60 votes out of 100 in order. So unless you have a supermajority in the Senate, then you can't be sure that you can pass your legislative agenda. So it makes fulfilling campaign promises extremely difficult. It also makes doing things that are controversial extremely difficult. It makes it difficult to assign praise or blame when something either does or does not get done. Because in order to get something done, you probably have to get cooperation from the other party. Then it's hard for your party to get full credit for, we did this, or escape the blame for, well, you promised us you were going to have comprehensive immigration reform. You were going to do all of these things. We couldn't. We didn't. So it also is difficult to assign blame, which politicians kind of like political cover. It causes gridlock. So if things need to be done quickly, having divided government can be a very big hindrance. If, though, you support the government doing less, divided government makes it harder for the government to do anything. So you get gridlock, you get threats of government shutdowns. We have had a lot of those in this period. And but some people see that as a good thing. It depends on your point of view. It's certainly we keep doing it. We keep electing different parties to control different branches of government. So that's a pattern that we have been falling into since 1969. So what do we make about that? What's happening? Our political parties used to be those political machines. They ran the world, and you wanted to get something done. That's those political party bosses in your city. That's where you needed to go. Some scholars think that the era we are in represents a real decline in the power of political parties, making them essentially impotent. And evidence for that is the voters are increasingly not aligning themselves with any particular party. A lot more people are identifying as independent or downright dissatisfied or disgusted with the existing parties, not just not ready to commit, but disliking them both. We have passed laws eliminating the political patronage and spoils system that people like Andrew Jackson really exploited. That was the corrupt underpinnings to those political machines. So politicians can't do that anymore. Part of having a professional bureaucracy is the idea there is that you've got the best people for the job and that they are apolitical. But it does mean that you don't have as many political appointments to give out to your friends. The government has a greatly increased role in providing social welfare benefits that used to be something that the parties would do. So your local party we'll take care of our voters and you'll vote for us. But as the government is increasingly doing that as on an official level, the parties aren't doing it, and so don't get the loyalty from that. We've also had changes in the way candidates are nominated. So now we have political primaries. So voters get to choose who the candidates are. We've also had the growth of media. So we don't rely on the political parties to give us all of our information about the candidates. If you will recall, last week we talked about how in the earliest forms of media, the newspaper were run by the political parties. That's who you got your news from. We're a long way from that now. Even though there is bias in the media, and some news outlets definitely are harder on one party than the other. But we're not directly getting our information from the parties anymore. Campaigns have become much more about the individual running and less about the party. Now, presidential candidates still have what's called a coattails effect, where if the president is either very, very popular or very, very unpopular, then you have other members of their party either seeking to identify with them or seeking to distance themselves from them. But the campaigns tend to center on the individual candidates, not on the party's slate. So you're encouraged to vote for Joe Blow, Democrat, but you don't. It's not so much about the party. It's more about Joe Blow. And that party affiliation is just sort of a shortcut if you happen to identify with the party. But they're, again, having to appeal to independent voters, so they can't rely on the fact that Joe Blow is the Democrat is going to be enough. One thing that has contributed to this is a Supreme Court case known as Citizens United versus the Federal Elections Commission. That's what FEC stands for. And this was about campaign financing. And what it did is it said that spending money is a protected form of speech, that you can spending money for advertising is speech and is protected by the First Amendment. So individuals or groups can buy advertisements to advocate for issues or candidates that they support. And so that allows for a lot of interest groups, rather than just the political parties, a lot of interest groups to run ads about particular issues and put this money in. The super PACs, political action committees, are formed and a lot of them are formed to support one candidate or another. And those are outside the party system, which gets around the spending limits. So are we in a post-party era? Maybe. Again, we have a lot of de-alignment, voters not identifying with a political party, a lot of ticket splitting, a lot of people or fewer people who vote it's called voting a straight ticket, where you just go and you check off all the Democrats or you check off all the Republicans. More people splitting their votes, voting for some candidates who are Democrats, some who are Republicans, maybe even some who are from a third party. Candidate-centered politics have grown in importance, and you have those candidate committees, organizations that support individual candidates outside the traditional party system. So are we in a post-party era? Are the political parties less and less relevant, or are they just regrouping? Only the future will tell. Perhaps where we are is at a moment of realignment. Maybe, who knows, maybe in the next few years you're going to see one of the existing parties change its characteristics. Only time will tell.